Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, all of you. I know some of you were up till 4 in the morning, so if this got you out of bed, I appreciate that. I hope it's worth it. It's true that this is this is mostly a new talk. There's a few slides I've reused, and some of you may be familiar with those if you see my talks. But generally, this is new, and sort of the downside of that is that it's rehearsed in my head, but not before an audience. So if I stumble a little bit or have to look at my notes, I hope you'll forgive me. First of all, I want to say how much of a pleasure it is to be here. My first time in Romania, and it's been just, I can't even say what a pleasure this has been. It's certainly exceeded my expectations in every way. And I have many people to thank, Howard primarily, but his wonderful colleagues that worked to organize this, Alexander and Vanessa and others, and of course Daniela. So again, thank you for giving me such a warm reception and making sure that I have a good time. So far, so good. And so it's great. It's great to be here, and it's great to meet so many old friends and new friends. Well, I guess we can start. Go ahead and start the first slide. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I'm going to probably try to use this pointer. Can people see that? I can see it. It may be useful. So the first thing I wanted to mention here kind of is just a little plug for the Hefter Research Institute, which I'm a member of the board and a founding member of the board. Go to hefter.org, Hefter, and find out what we're all about. We're basically a nonprofit, a bunch of nerds, a bunch of science-oriented people. Created this foundation about 23 years ago to investigate good science and discover therapeutic applications for psychedelics. Never in our wildest imagination did we realize we'd be at this point now. What we envisioned has manifested, and even far beyond that. So I'm happy to see it. I think that the world is in the process of a global shift in consciousness, and we certainly need it. Our world is in a state of crisis, and we're finally rediscovering these plant teachers, which have always been there, and now we're learning what lessons they have to tell our species in the third millennium of history, probably almost definitely the last millennium of history. So, yeah, that's the Hefter. Now let's see if this works. And I know it's going to. Right. So when we talk about consciousness, consciousness is a very loaded word. And first of all, we have to agree on what consciousness is, because there are many definitions, and we could give a whole talk and, in fact, have whole symposia on just exactly what is consciousness. This has been the major preoccupation of Western philosophy for centuries. We're not really that much closer to the answers, because philosophers and scientists, one thing they do is they squabble. And they don't agree on a lot of stuff. But I think everyone in this room, those of us who are not asleep, can agree that there is such a thing as consciousness, and when we're awake, we're in that state. So we'll talk a little bit about that. There are various definitions for consciousness. And, one place to start, always when you have a big, broad topic like that, is, let's start with a dictionary. What does a dictionary say about consciousness? Well, there's at least 7 definitions of what consciousness might be, but I think it's the first 2 that are kind of relevant to the discussion today. Philosophy talks about consciousness endlessly, and basically says it's the mind, or mental faculties, as characterized by thought, feelings, and volition. Okay, that's a good starting point. We're not going to get into the minutiae of defining consciousness, or we'd be here all day. Another one is simply the state of being conscious, awareness of one's own existence, your sensations, your thoughts, your surroundings, all blended together in what we experience as experience, subjective experience. So, pretty lame, and then the rest of them are more or less similar, but not all that relevant in some ways. Now this is kind of a busy slide, and I'm not sure how relevant it is, but some of these terms might be useful. Philosophers and neuroscientists talk about the easy versus the hard problem of consciousness. And the distinction is kind of the disjunct between all the things we can describe on the outside that seem to involve consciousness, but really aren't consciousness. They're external ways of measuring what's going on when you're conscious. So there is that. But how to bring those two together? If you look at an fMRI or some other neuroimaging technology, you can say, well, in certain states, certain parts of the brain are active. How do you extrapolate from that to what the person is actually experiencing? We still haven't crossed that threshold. This is the major challenge for neuroscience this century, is to see how we can relate those things. We can obviously make a distinction between awareness and wakefulness. Awareness means only subjective experience. But in clinical anesthesiology, what happened to be a discipline that can manipulate consciousness, including obliterate consciousness temporarily. So that's a useful tool. What goes away when you're under an anesthetic? And then there's wakefulness refers to brain arousal. You need to be in a state of arousal to really be conscious. And even that can occur in pathological conditions of unconsciousness, like vegetative states. A person may be in a vegetative state, but they're still aware in some sense. There's no external sign of it. Another useful thing to look at is phenomenal versus the subjective experience of itself. In other words, consciousness is that which is available to cognitive processes. We have a subjective world that goes on, and then we have access to that, ways to speak about that subjective state, which is called access consciousness. Then there's external versus internal consciousness. And those are loaded words, external and internal. Simple words, but very tricky to define them precisely. So external consciousness is supposedly the experience of environmental stimuli, such as the sound of an orchestra, whereas internal consciousness is an endogenous experience, something that's entirely within, such as dreams. And then there's consciousness versus responsiveness. You can be conscious, but not responsive. And this is seen in medicine all the time, where a person is completely unable to respond. But again, the brain is busy working. And then there are levels of consciousness versus contents of consciousness. Levels of consciousness includes distinctions, say, between sleep and waking, but the contents of consciousness refer to particular phenomenal aspects of our experience, such as the redness of a rose or other types of experience. So I don't know if those definitions are useful, but there they are, and we'll see if they are. Okay, so let's, this talk is about the antiquity of consciousness. How old is consciousness? And then in order to discuss that, we have to talk about evolutionary biology and the phylogeny of life on the planet. And we're to sort of orient ourselves, because we have to understand that consciousness is a phenomenon that emerged from life, on Earth at least. So when did it show up? When did that novel phenomenon in biological evolution appear? Well, this is a quick, or a sort of a timeline of life on Earth starting about 4.5 billion years ago. The Earth's been around a long time. And then we have simple life, and then we have photosynthetic organisms, which we'll be saying a lot about, mainly plants, right? First appeared around 3 billion years ago. Those weren't plants, those were bacteria that figured out how this process of photosynthesis. Then you've got your eukaryotes, which in biology are things with nuclei. Prokaryotes were primitive organisms that were before that kind of cellular differentiation occurred. And an interesting note here, the oxygen crisis. Before this, there was little oxygen in the atmosphere. And when photosynthetic organisms appeared on the planet, they started pumping out oxygen, which was lucky for us because we happened to use oxygen. But at the time, oxygen was the first environmental pollutant. Oxygen was a toxin for most of the organisms on the Earth at the time, prokaryotic bacteria. And it actually forced them underground. It forced them to seek niches in the environment and actually in other organisms that would protect them from the toxicity of oxygen. Anyway, so that was a pretty important thing. And another one of these things, another one of these challenges in the evolution of life, when oxygen appeared on the planet, it was a threat to everything alive. But it overcame. And finally, around 1.5 billion years or so, we got complex multicellular life began to appear. Sex appeared, the differentiation of sex, which was a tremendous advance because it enhanced gene exchange and the diversity of the genome, and it enabled selection to have a role. We're really late in all this. Land animals, land plants, dinosaurs, mammals, flowers all occurred less than 500 million years ago. And we're, like the last 5 seconds of that process, right? So there are other ways to look at this phylogeny, which we will look at. Well, they talk about deep time, right? AV man, why is my slide not changing? There we are. So this is another way to look at phylogeny. And it's just a cool way to look at it, the spiral representation of phylogeny. It all starts back here, with the condensate, the appearance of water and other molecules that can support life way back 4 billion years ago. And then it spirals around. And that's just a beautiful way to depict it. We're the tiniest slice of this last era here, which is called the Holocene. We have appeared in the history of life on Earth in the late Holocene. Okay. My remote is not working. Wait. Maybe I have to hit it twice or something. Okay, so going back to this relatively recent era in the history of life, then we can say, well, what were the milestones in the emergence of what we've agreed to call consciousness? And, it's not very long, but way back around 540 million years ago, the early Cambrian, organisms began to display properties that certainly were necessary precursors to consciousness. They certainly weren't consciousness, but the ability to sense the environment and respond to it. That's one of the fundamental necessities for consciousness. And then motility. the ability to move. That's pretty convenient if something's trying to eat you. You can swim away, right, or fly away, or whatever you do. So you know, that's a kind of sentience, and that's the earliest, you know, sort of fundamentals of consciousness. And then around 315 million years ago, there began to appear the first vertebrates, the first multicellular and highly complex organisms, of which mammals were one of those. And in that process, you saw or occurred the evolution of distinct structures, primitive brain stems, primitive diencephalic structures such as the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and the neocortex, which was again a late development, and that's really kind of, in many ways, the advanced neocortex is what distinguishes us from everything else. So these structures made feedback processing possible and recurrent feedback processing. So this is the neural core for primitive consciousness in vertebrates, and we're vertebrates. So without that, it doesn't go forward, but consciousness of the self which again is one of these milestones in the appearance, didn't really show up until about 5 million years ago. So it's quite recent. And there's a way to test this called the MSR, the mirror self-recognition. And this has been pretty well established in ethology that, you know, a great ape, a chimpanzee, for example, can recognize itself in a mirror. And it realizes that it is the self, looking back at it. And I won't go into the details, but this was a major thing. Awareness of self-existence. Things before that, presumably, didn't have that. And then expansion of this neocortex that enabled us to have a rich inner experience, an oniric state, a dreamlike state, advanced symbolic processing, reflection and projection in time, and awareness of time, and the way that we stretch our existence through time. Now, not everything in this process had these things. You know, we're sort of the most complex reflection of that. And then also the neocortex introduced anterior to posterior reference. In other words, the impulses that govern our responses to stimuli originate, you know, the neocortex is the major processing area for that. So enhanced neocortical activity, connectivity. That occurred about 4 to 2 million years ago. Okay. All right, so now we come to this relatively recent phylogenetic time, and we can talk about the evolution of hominids, or the emergence of hominids, which is a general term for a type of primate that's not a monkey and not an ape. The hominids are kind of the term for species that, if not us, if not the most advanced, or that, again, we have to be careful how we use that word, but primates that were really human, or at least that we grant the status of calling them human by naming them Homo this, Homo that. And this is an interesting diagram. One of the big puzzles in evolution, paleoanthropology, is the explosive expansion of the size of the human brain. And this happened over a very short period of time, evolutionarily. This is the capacity of the size of the brain, or the capacity of the cranium in cubic centimeters. This is years, millions of years on that axis, right? And during this period, we went from a languageless, toolless, four-legged primates to two-legged, tool-wielding, verbally expressive, and eventually deity-worshipping human beings. All of this happened long before the invention of writing, long before the invention of any kind of complex language. So this really, the first hominids really appeared around and here's Homo habilis, that's thought to be the first one. Appeared about 2 million years ago, and pretty much the show was over by 1.5 million years ago. But then the next ancestor, yes, and I caution you to remember, all these models are provisional. You know, new discoveries are being made, and so this is a dynamic system, and this is probably already out of date. But after Homo habilis, the next one up was Homo erectus. Oh, okay. I can't even see my own. This one here. Homo erectus was our immediate ancestors and was in very many ways basically human. It had a very modern kind of brain, very similar to our own, and we know from archaeological records and so on that it did. It had technologies, it had behaviors, social structures, and so on, that clearly couldn't happen without some form of consciousness. And so far in this evolutionary record, you'd have to say that Homo erectus there appeared maybe 1.75 million years ago. And they died out maybe only 100,000 years ago. So Homo erectus had the longest run of any of these hominid species. The most successful human species so far is not us, but Homo erectus. They managed to keep it going for almost 2 million years. That's a long time. We, Homo sapiens, the so-called Homo sapiens means wise, right? So the wise hominin. I think we're going to have to revise that classification. But we didn't appear, Homo sapiens appeared along with Neanderthals about the same time. We've only been around for 100,000 years. That's about there. So we have a long way to go before we would give the Homo erectus a run for its money, right? I mean, and the way it's looking now, it won't even be close. So, that's something to keep in mind. Yeah. All right. So, I guess the take-home lesson from this slide is this enormous and rapid expansion of the size of the brain over 2 million years. In evolutionary time, 2 million years is a blink of an eye, right? I mean, evolution moves slowly. It didn't in this case. Why didn't it? These are some of the questions we might ask. All right. So at the end of that process, when neurologically modern brains appeared, you might say things really got complicated, and they got complicated fast. The brain is actually the most complex structure we know in the known universe. I emphasize the known universe. So, let's see. Hopefully this will work. So just some gee whiz comparisons, right? The number of synapses in an adult human brain is estimated to be between 100 and 500 trillion. And it contains more connections than all of the computers and routers on the internet. So evolution has come up with this 3 pounds of squishy tissue that has more capacities than the most modern, most advanced supercomputer. It's slower than supercomputers, but it's much more complex. And if you want to compare that to the Milky Way, another complex, large structure, contains only about 100 billion stars. So if each synapse in the brain, the connections between neurons, is a star, our brains are the equivalent of 1,000 galaxies. So, be impressed. Okay. So that we have to ask the question, what were the catalysts? What gave rise to this state of affairs that we find ourselves in, that we are both blessed and cursed with? Well, certainly the emergence of the controlled use of fire and the invention of cooking that enabled, the invention of the most primitive forms of food processing, essentially, had an enormous impact. on, and mostly beneficial, into daily life of these hominids, on nutrition, on hunting primarily. The ability to use fire was more significant than almost anything that's occurred in human evolution, except perhaps the emergence of language and cognition. But being able to use fire could allow humans to do things in the dark, like have ceremonies and paint, but although cave painting is much, much more recent than this. But it was provided protection from predators. It vastly expanded the nutritional choices available, and it promoted omnivory, which is the ability to basically eat anything in sight. That expanded the choices, and that really affected human evolution, because suddenly, sources of protein, which are important for all this type of development that weren't before available, are suddenly available. Fire enabled people to kill parasites in meat, which were, so that was a protection. And because you could cook food and partly break it down, you didn't have to spend so much energy chewing stuff. So you had more metabolic energy to do other more interesting things. Significantly, the use of fire enabled the transition of our species from an arboreal, from a forest-based habitat to the savanna. We moved out onto the plains because fire was much more easy to manage and control in a savanna environment, right? I mean, imagine the hazards if you live in a forest fires, right? That was very significant because the use of fire in savannas enabled hominids to hunt game, using fire often to drive herds over cliffs and things like this. So a species that was normally starving, food was hard to find. Suddenly there's an abundance of food and good, rich animal protein that they could get using fire in these savanna environments. And it enabled us to use more efficiently all the complex carbohydrates coming mainly from plants that enhance the absorption of food energy per unit of food consumed. So in other words, we could actually get along on less food, but it was nutritionally rich, and so we benefited in that way. And also it enabled things like the fire hardening of spear points and the use of plant resins to make a kind of glue. So this stone spear points and that sort of thing could be affixed to sticks, which were, also fire hardened. So you've got spears, and spears were much more efficient. You've got to get up close to a mammoth if you're going to use a bow and arrow, but if you have a spear, you can throw it and, run away. And if you speared a mammoth, I recommend that you run away. Okay, so the other effect that this had in some ways is that, they often say you are what you eat, and you are what you eat, obviously. You take in nutrients from the environment, you metabolize them into things that you need to survive, the molecules of your metabolism. And I like this slide because it very well reflects this close relationship between plants and humans. We are parasites on plants. Just about everything else is. Everything that does not make its own food in some ways is not photosynthetic, is a parasite on these wonderful plants that we have been blessed with. And I want to present the idea of a chemical ecology. There is actually a discipline called chemical ecology. And we're made of chemicals. Plants are made of chemicals. Everything else living is made of chemicals at some level, right? So we're immersed in this chemically biodiverse environment reflected by the diversity of plants that we consume. And so this is a kind of symbiosis. It existed before, but this was another sort of major threshold in the complexification of symbiosis. Hominids could utilize plants now were certainly nutritional, but they could also use fire to do things to that food, to make it easier to consume. Simple things that we think of, such as making teas, making water extracts. So that's interesting, because the ability to boil plants and make teas and burn them up, and also burn bones and this sort of thing, and most of the evidence for the use of fire has to do not with plants, but more with the remains of animals that they ate on. But essentially, that simple technology provided hominids with the essential basis of two things: chemistry and pharmacology. We've discovered the uses of medicines essentially by millions of years, possibly, certainly hundreds of thousands of years of kind of random experimentation, trial and error experimentation, which we can sort of put under the rubric of mucking around with plants, right? And in that process, many people died, but also discoveries were made, and we discovered medicines, and we discovered other properties. Should be changing that slide. Can I change that slide? Maybe not. So out of this, we eat plants, of course, but we get many, many other things from plants, like medicines and fibers and construction materials and perfumes, and you name it, all the plant products that we value so much. So that, oops, I want to go back. Can I go back? There, okay. So what does this come from? It comes from the fact that plants are great chemists. Plants have figured out this trick, which no one has been able to duplicate. Well, bacteria knew it long before there were even plants, but plants are photosynthetic. That means that they can use the energy of sunlight to capture the energy of sunlight from the cosmos, from the sun, bring that energy into the biosphere in a useful way through these light harvesting pigments like chlorophyll. And they use that energy in photosynthesis to use carbon dioxide and water and sunlight to make complex organic compounds. And the initial products of photosynthesis are simple sugars, basically, but from that, many things come. And two major byproducts or benefits of photosynthesis, since the precursors, one of the major reactants in photosynthesis is carbon dioxide. So it's plants that are sequestering carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and keeping the levels of carbon dioxide at tolerable levels and using that to grow plants. And we're now in the process of disrupting those, for example, by burning down tropical rainforests. Not only do we remove those carbon sinks, but we re-release the carbon that's already tied up in those, the rotting remnants of those plants. So it's a double whammy, and that's one of the impacts of large populations. But photosynthesis is one of the things that carbon sequestration, mainly through plants. There are estimates that about a third, at least, maybe a third to 40% of so-called anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are due to the burning down of tropical rainforests. So we don't need new technologies, we just need to put the fires out. Getting the political and consensus to do that seems to be almost insurmountable, but that would fix much of the problem. The other cool thing that plants do through photosynthesis, they produce oxygen as a byproduct, and we happen to need oxygen. In fact, life would be hard without it. We wouldn't be here without it. So we breathe oxygen. So plants have benefited us in so many ways by this simple chemistry. And as a result of that, you get this, I see, there's a timeline, but I don't fall off the stage. That would be embarrassing. So here's a complex diagram. There won't be a test on this, you can be sure. But just to go over it a little bit. Here you've got sunlight, you've got carbon dioxide plus water. The other the other reactant, and in photosynthesis, through captured light energy captured through chlorophyll is used to actually split water, to ionize water, and those hydrogens are used to reduce carbon, to shift it from an inorganic compound to an organic compound. And so the first products of photosynthesis are simple sugars. And from that, there are all sorts of things branch out. This is kind of these things in the blue boxes are what are called primary metabolites. They're pretty much universal in all plants. And they're the molecules of life. They're the things that drive life. They're pretty much universal in animals too. Things like, nucleotides, and which are the basic building blocks of DNA, and aromatic amino acids, which go into proteins, and non-aromatic amino acids, because proteins are made up of amino acids, right? And they come from this process. And so there are many of these primary metabolites, which are really important. But then in the yellow boxes, plants also make what they call secondary metabolites. And that's kind of an old term, and it implies that these secondary metabolites in the yellow boxes are not important. Well, they're very important. Plants don't waste their time. Even though they're good chemists, they just don't make these things for fun. Well, maybe they do. So maybe they make them for our fun, but we'll get into that. So in these yellow boxes, there's some interesting things. There's the terpenes, the the plant steroids, and the diterpenes, the pigments, the carotenoids, the high molecular weight terpenes, even rubber. Even rubber is essentially a polyterpene. So you've got this class of things. You've got your phenolics, which are abundant in plants, and a lot of these are the colored constituents in plants, the things that make flowers and leaves in the fall when the chlorophyll is burned off. What's left are the flavonoids, which are brightly colored, and the tannins and the lignins, and all of these things have enormous biological activities of all sorts. And each of these boxes, bear in mind, represent classes of thousands and thousands of compounds, right? From our point of view, with our particular preoccupation, I'm sorry. Okay, are these are the nitrogen-containing secondary products, like alkaloids. And most of the medicines that are important to us, that are natural, many of the medicines are alkaloids, which means simply a secondary product that contains nitrogen. That would be the simplest definition. And the alkaloids are interesting from that perspective because they often have biological activity. Many of them are toxic, which is useful often for the plants and sometimes to us. Many of them are psychoactive, or maybe that's too specific a word to use. They interact with neuroreceptors, whether or not psychoactive. But things began to get interesting, when we discovered these nitrogen-containing compounds. Okay. So what do they use these molecules for? If they're secondary, what are they used for? What they are used for is plants. The language of plants is chemistry. Plants use these secondary compounds as messenger molecules to regulate virtually every interaction with everything else in the environment. Plants they can't run away. Plants have substituted biosynthesis for behavior, and they respond to challenges of their environment and opportunities of their environment through chemistry, right? That's what they use to mediate with other organisms, and that includes other plants, obviously, and fungi and microorganisms that might be in the soil, insects, herbivores, things that want to nibble on plants, consume plants, and of course we're part of that. And they use them for a variety of purposes. Defense is one obvious one. Many of these things are toxic, And so the defense is simply their repellents. They make a plant, not pleasant to consume, and that may be in the interest of the plant. Just leave me alone. I don't want to be molested. I'm bitter. You don't want to, But it gets more interesting on that, as we'll see. But one of the, two of the major other functions are semiosis and symbiosis. Semiosis, just the word is like from semaphore, a signaling. Semiosis is a signaling function. And almost all of these secondary compounds have some kind of a signaling function. There's the simple one of repellent, leave me alone. It gets more interesting when it's more complex. The semiotic signal sent out by the secondary metabolites may encourage interaction with it. In other words, so instead of go away, it's like come closer. Let's do interesting things together. Let's form a symbiosis. And a symbiosis in biology it's a close association of two different organisms, often for mutual benefit, right? And probably the one that's been studied most in this area is, do I have to push this again? Okay. Well, insects. Insects and plants have an evolutionary history of symbiosis mediated through this chemistry that goes back way, way back. Well, not that far back, because insects are important in the pollination of plants. And the flowering plants are not that old. They've been around, well, some species have been around 100, 150 million years ago, but the flowering plants did not actually flower, if you will, in the Earth's biosphere until after that asteroid impact that came along and wiped out the dinosaurs. It also wiped out the non-flowering, spore-bearing plants. A good many of those, they retreated to marginal niches. The flowering plants took over, along with the insects. It was a conspiracy between plants and insects to make the flowering plants successful. And, well, I think you all understand that plants, flowering plants depend on pollinators to complete their life cycle. This is why the crisis with the bees, with the colony collapse, should be a major concern. Nobody cares, nobody's thinking about it. Or a few people are, and nobody else is listening. This is all a chemically mediated process, this plant-insect interaction, and it's reflected in the insect's biochemistry as well. Plants make flavors, they make color, they make aromas that attract the pollinators, they make colors in the flowers and fruits that attract pollinators, and also in fruits that the birds and other things disperse the seeds. So it's a very complex symbiosis that you see in plants, between plants and insects. And we are also part of this chemical web of symbiosis, both individuals and as a species. We're involved in symbiosis with plants. And our very survival depends on it because, as I said, we're parasites on plants. They provide us with everything essential to life, nutrition, which is kind of important. Okay. So if we look at our species, what's the impact of this symbiotic, chemically mediated relationship? Again, back to the idea of a chemical ecology. Here we are, primates, hungry primates. We're looking for anything we can find that might be edible. So we're scanning the environment for edible possibilities. We're immersed in this chemically complex chemical ecology with all these secondary metabolites spread all over the place, many of them with biological or pharmacological activity of one kind or another. So what are the consequences of that? Well, this diagram shows biological effects in humans triggered by exposure to dietary plant chemicals. A number of effects result from this. You got your secondary compounds, and you have the human dietary exposure. Where does that go from there? Simply nowhere. Okay, so you have two pathways. You've got direct effects of the phenotype, meaning the individual expression of genetic potential, in a sense. Effects of these secondary compounds on the phenotype is manifested in things like recognition, avoidance, repulsion mechanisms, vomiting, and diarrhea. All of these are essentially behavioral responses to these secondary metabolites that we're consuming. You also have, again, cooking, behavioral detoxification techniques, as well as making food easier to digest. It's also got extensive applications in making toxic plants less toxic so that we can consume them. Again, having to do with this expansion of the options available for nutrition. Phenotypic expression is also seen in the activation of physiological detoxification mechanisms involving the GI system and endocrine metabolism. And that's just a complicated way to say we adapt to our chemical environment as individuals. Everybody is a biochemical individual. And you can look at this by looking at gene expression patterns. That's why we're chemically unique. Every person is a unique has a unique chemical fingerprint based on their exposure to their particular chemical ecology, right? So we're all biochemical individuals. Now, this is also reflected on the level of the genotype, too. Direct effects on the genotype. This environmental exposure leads to changes in DNA structure and DNA processes. In other words, there is a feedback from the environment to gene expression. The genome will respond to this chemical environment. That will lead to molecular changes in specific gene products. For example, the induction of enzymes that are always, the potential is always there, but they may not be expressed because they may not be needed. But then they will respond to the specific needs of the specific chemical ecology, right? In enzyme induction or hormone induction, these are all a reflection of that. What does that lead to? It leads to what they call, again, kind of initiated variations in diverse metabolic processes. All of this comes together and you get modifications in disease susceptibility because many of these things are biologically active, right? So a simple example, you've got one population that may be in a valley where a plant grows and is consumed that has a strong stimulating effect on the immune system. And the immune system is one way to our mechanism of disease resistance, right? So that population has a leg up over the population across the hill where that plant might not occur. Higher incidences of disease in that population and no way to protect themselves. So we can guess which one is going to have differential survival. And that leads to changes in individual and group biological fitness, right? And fitness is important in evolution, as Darwin explained. And eventually this leads to shifts in gene frequencies based on these differential survival and reproduction processes. And that has evolutionary consequences. This is the way evolution happens, at least part of the picture of the way evolution happens, the expression of these genetic expressions, and you lead to genetic drift. So I guess the take on this is certain gene complexes become dominant, right? And others don't survive. They pass away. And that's partly how it happens. So, okay, back to fire for a minute, because fire is one of the catalysts in this process. And this chart has a lot of gaps, for one thing. It's a very incomplete picture, but the picture is complete enough that we have a kind of a handle on when fire was first controlled use of fire, and cooking technologies that went with that first appeared maybe 1.7 million years ago. In China, there's remnants of charred bones in cave sites. They had fire when they were burning bones, presumably, or animals, probably cooking them in some crude way, and also splitting the bones and getting marrow out. That was the major source of nutrition. And then about 1 million years ago, or in Kenya, there's another site. This is interesting. There is fire-hardened pottery shards at this site, which would not occur unless they were able to generate temperatures greater than 700 degrees. So this speaks of rather complex technology. Interestingly, we can't really say that these were part of pottery shards because the rest of the evidence is that pottery was really a very recent invention. I mean, they didn't actually have pots or pottery until maybe 20, 30,000 years ago. That's what the evidence said, but there's reason to doubt it. But somehow they were able to cook, and the thinking is maybe they used, they dug holes in the ground, or they found depressions in rocks, so they would dump superheated rocks into these holes, and that was how they cooked. So you get this progression here. 1.7, 1.5, 1 million years, and then, relatively recent, the so-called Cave of Hearst in South Africa, maybe 200 to 700 kilo years ago. This is a term, 200 to 700,000 years ago. So really yesterday, and you get these Acheulean tools, which is one type of tool, fairly advanced tool. So you have this evidence for the use of fire, which over time became more and more sophisticated. And this controlled use of fire had enormous consequences, not only on nutrition, and enabled us to be better fed and stronger and meaner and all that because of the aggressive byproducts of eating meat, right? We were the baddest asses on the planet, right? Very dangerous. But it also affected the emergence of consciousness. These most ancient technologies were not done by us. They weren't done by modern humans. They weren't even done by Homo erectus. They were done by the ancestors of Homo erectus. So this goes way, way back. The ability to use these technologies implies that these hominids had planning, they were able to plan, they were able to cooperate, they were able to invent things. It required skill to pull the technology, the resources together needed to make fire and use it in a constructive way. And these had to be conscious in some way. These were not, this was not done in a dream. They thought about it. And one of the major impacts was that this enabled this transition from the arboreal to the savanna environment. And in the savanna, they would encounter ungulate species. They would encounter hoofed species like cattle, like antelopes, like bison, like deer, all these things. So these big animals that were just like walking sacks of protein. And, very, very tempting, right? And so you got your primates on the plain, and they were in contact with these ungulates. But along with the ungulates, turns out this little mushroom called Psilocybe cubensis is a symbiote on the dung of these species. It is the preferred substrate. And these mushrooms, are not vanishing flowers. If you've ever seen Psilocybe cubensis in the field, they can get big, tall. You can't be in that environment and not notice them. And it helps that they're golden caps. I mean, this is like, talk about semiosis. It's just putting a beacon out there to these hungry primates. And so they came in contact with them. And they consumed them, because there they were, and they consumed them. And of course, we know the effects that, that they had. And then also, these transference of these technologies into the savanna displaced, again, that's important to emphasize, the basic tools of chemistry and pharmacology. The ability to make plant extracts, muck around with plant extracts. But this was probably still maybe, a few 100,000 years in the future. Why did that happen? Okay. But the technology was there. The basic tools were there. It took us a while to learn how to use them. But while we were doing that, we were growing up in an environment with ungulates and with these mushrooms in the... and these mushrooms, Psilocybin is still around. It is the pan-tropical psychedelic mushroom. Every time, all around the world, whenever you have warm, rainy environments with ungulates, now it's usually cattle, you're going to find these mushrooms. They are not hard to find. And so the exposure would be there. And when they sampled these big, beautiful mushrooms, not only did it satisfy their appetite, but it had some surprises. They were in for a shock, in a sense. And these initial encounters were probably accidental at first, but not for long, because then they realized the effect of them. And, well, that was interesting, and they were advanced enough neurologically and road to consciousness to be able to say, well, that was interesting. It stimulated self-reflection. And it provided a boost to cognition. It boosted this ability to look back on themselves. It boosted the ability to have rich interior experiences. It fostered the transition from phenomenal consciousness to access consciousness. Not only did we have a rich life, but we can relate that in ways of expression, such as art, right? And that was kind of the roots, that was the essential connection that enabled artistic expression to occur. And it was that relationship that kind of got us, where we are now, for good or ill. We're the human species, modern humans. We are an anomaly in nature. People say, well, we're just animals. Well, we're animals, but we're a very special kind of animals, and we display behaviors that do not show up in any other species. We're the only species with a complex language. We're the only technology-utilizing species, and I'm not talking about digging sticks to get termites out of logs. I'm talking about spears and art and eventually starships and all that. Nothing else is going to come up with that, as far as we know, or if they do, we want to know about it. Another major thing is we're a species that stores information outside of ourselves. We developed writing and speech, and we were able to, before that was not possible, and we developed oral traditions. We developed ways, technologies for putting information out there in various forms and transmitting it through time and space. We could transmit it geographically, to other cultures. We could also, of course, it was the roots of history. We didn't really think of it as history at that point, but it really was the roots of history. And as a result, we came into a realm where we lived in a world of ideas, a world of abstractions, a world that was real as the physically experienced world that we were immersed in, not by choice. That's the world we still inhabit, most of us to this day inhabit a world of abstractions. And this is the foundation of human culture, the ability to perceive symbols that are meaningless, to perceive abstractions and attribute significance to them. And culture is the big game changer, right? Culture is the edifice comprised of art and science, religion, magic, myth, medicine, technology, folklore, law, etc. Everything that we associated with culture that other species don't have. Also, it's clear that were it not for language, we would not be able to have culture. And were it not for this neurologically very complex brain, we couldn't have language. in the way I'm talking about, beyond primitive signaling functions, right? And neuroanatomists know that a great deal of the modern brain is devoted to the production, comprehension of language. This neocortex, much of it has to do with linguistic functions, and so the thinking is evolutionarily, that was what stimulated the rapid expansion of the cortex, at least in part. So along comes culture. Very complicated and very problematic, right? And essentially, the contention here is that, we learn. The mushrooms were teaching tools. They were neurocognitive teaching tools that enabled us to learn language and to learn cognition and to learn the association between symbols and visual representations and even auditory representations. Without culture, there is no, without language, there is no culture. Culture is made of language. And this complex relationship depends on this relationship between abstractions, ideas, and signification. Mushrooms taught us that ability. And the comprehension, the process of comprehension, results from the discovery of these meaningful relationships between words, images, and symbols, including sound. And this is the basis of cognition. So now, which is awareness, a way of knowing. How did that come about? Well, in language we associate essentially meaningless sounds with meaningful images and meaningful symbols. I mean, my brother used to talk about small mouth noises, as primates were able to make small mouth noises. Inherently meaningless, except that we have the internal processing going on that endows them with meaning. And as I mentioned, this human neural architecture is dedicated to this process, ability to associate sounds, images, and symbols in meaningful ways. And this involves synesthesia. This is my thesis. Synesthesia, as you all know, is the experience of one sensory modality in another. And the most common is, you can see sounds, or, you can hear colors. That's kind of the basis of synesthesia. And in language, we do this. It is essentially that. It's completely unconscious. Again, as we know, psychedelics really facilitate synesthesia. That's why these altered states are so fascinating, because this is, of course, a picture by Paulo Alberto called synesthesia. And in ayahuasca and other ritual states, these fantastic images and the interior movies that play and so on, I mean, they're interesting, but they're more than interesting. They're interesting because they're weighted with meaning and significance. They have an emotional component and a cognitive component that's just very impactful, right? And that's because we have learned this skill. And some people are genetically synesthetic. They figure between 1 and 10% of people have genetic ability for synesthesia, but we won't go into that here. There's also evidence that children are more spontaneously synesthetic than adults, because we've learned things that really suppress that for various reasons, until, of course, we discover psychedelics, and then we rediscover this skill, which is ancient. But there must be a time when this discovery was first made. And so the premise is, was that this spontaneous synesthesia that plants that they came in contact could induce, did this provide the triggering event in the unfolding saga of human evolution? The event that led to the realization of the equivalence of sound and image, and hence gave rise to the first true human language? Well, of course, nobody knows. So we're free to speculate. And we're free to speculate. And this is my premise, that these early exposure to psychedelics they were neurocognitive programmers. Essentially, they taught us how to use our brains. And in indigenous cultures, the notion that these sacred plants are teachers is found worldwide. They're plant teachers, right? They're teaching us. They're teaching us how to be human, and how to think, and how to apprehend the world, and derive meaning from all of those processes. And they're teaching us about this consensual reality and how to inhabit it, and how to create it, and how to then make it useful and generate an internal reality that is the one we inhabit, an internal reality that is essentially a model of the world. We don't inhabit the real world. We inhabit a model of the world. Physicists tell us that this world here, this world of hard tables and soft people and that sort of thing, this is not real. Physicists don't really know what's real, but our instruments tell us that the world does not look like this. The real world, quote unquote, the real world is unknowable, right? What we experience, my buttons mixed up here. What we do is we generate a model of the world, and that's the world that we live in. And it's evolutionarily very useful because a lot of what happens is it filters out useless information. Right? Our sensory apparatus is flooded with information. Most of it is not useful. If we apprehended it all, if we were aware of it all, it would just be a blooming, buzzing confusion, as James Joyce called it. What happened is we apprehend the world through this sensory neural interface here, our sensory, and we output our responses to this information through the same filter. And in neurophysiology, this is called gating. And gatings are modulable. You can lower and raise the gates depending on what you want to let in. So by integrating this input filter through this neural interface, and then we combine it with the interpretive and associative functions of inner experience, we construct this model of reality, essentially a hallucination, or a movie, or the script that we write for ourselves. And then we live inside that hallucination and proceed to call it reality. And, they're all filtered through this sensory neural interface. And so so this in some ways addresses a little bit the question of, is consciousness out there? Is consciousness in here? And all these, notions about internal and external. Does the brain generate consciousness, or does something else generate consciousness, and we're just receivers? The answer is both. We receive information from the outside, and then our brains, which is what they process information. They're quantum computers, and they make that information meaningful, or they help at least, develop meaningful attributes. So we have, effects, such as significance, or so-called, and also called portentiousness. And the intuition of a transpersonal realm, some kind of transcendent other, an element of reality that is unseen, most of the time. The philosopher Rudolf Otto has called this the mysterium tremendum. And even if you don't know Latin, you can interpret that. The mysterium tremendum is something like this. The mysterium tremendum is something that, as a species, we came in contact with that was utterly alien, completely terrifying, and totally, totally just very important. something that could not be comprehended, but completely fascinating. We could not take our eyes away from it, even though, you know, it is terrifying. And how many people have seen 2001, The Space Oddity? Well, a few of you. Okay, those who haven't, this is your homework. You know, 2001 was made in 1968, I think. Still, possibly the greatest science fiction movie ever made. Go watch it after you go home. I'll be checking on you. This is important. And in the 2001, Stanley Kubrick represents this Mysterium Tremendum this way, as this monolith, this incomprehensible geometric object that somehow suddenly appears in the Serengeti plain in a colony of these primates that are just, you know, doing what primates do, right? Doing monkey things, and all of a sudden this thing appears. It's like, whoa, what is this, right? It comes from outside anything in their ken. It comes from outside time and space. And in the story, the Mysterium Tremendum appears not once, but many times in prehistory and history, at critical junctures. It appears at critical moments. And it influences human history and cognitive evolution in ways that are mysterious and far beyond our control, right? And, well, I'm going to show some slides here which weren't originally in the original talk, but because a gentleman went to the trouble to locate pictures, I'll just go through these quickly and you'll get the idea. Now, which button controls that? So this is the monolith, right? This black, incomprehensible object. And it sits there. And it first appears in human history, maybe 2 million years ago. You know, this colony of primates, they wake up one morning and, oh my God, here's this thing right in the middle of them. You know, and I mean, even we would be taken aback if this happened. So they don't know what the hell is going on. But again, they're fascinated by it. And it is transmitting meaning to them, telepathically or whatever. And in this early opening sequence, what happens is one of these primates, clearly the alpha male, right, has discovered something. He's sitting in a bone pile there and he picks up a femur of one of these animals and he said, what could I do with that? I could knock an animal down with that. I could knock my next rival in the tribe down with that. Very useful tool, and he's looking at it. You can see he's contemplating the possibilities, right? Wow, what a discovery. And he's like, being an alpha male, he's full of testosterone, he's full of hostility and, you know, dominance and all this. And here suddenly this tool is put into his hands that really at the time, I mean, this was the atomic bomb of war technology at that time. So in this sequence, he picks this thing up and he starts, you know, smashing these bones like a crazy person and just going absolutely crazy. If you've seen the sequence, you know what I'm talking about. And at the close of this sequence, he tosses the femur into the air and starts falling back, right? And in the movie, it cuts then to, it does cut to, thank you, this, a space station. And 2 million years in a flash, right, we go. And here we are. And then the movie starts. So that sets the stage. Here we are, beginning finally to spread into the near solar system. And we have these technologies. So that's how the movie starts off, which I think is an amazing thing. But you don't have to have a monolith, and you don't have to go to Jupiter to find the Mysterium Tremendum, because the Mysterium Tremendum are the natural psychedelics. They've always been there in human evolution, just quietly waiting for us to discover them. And once we discovered them, that catalyzed this mystery. That opened the world, the mind, to these inner realms. And the psychedelic teachers, that was kind of like the psychedelic teachers' first appearance on the stage. They say, wait a minute, you monkeys are not running the show. We're running the show. The cognitive plants. And we're the teachers, and you better listen, because we have a lot to tell you. And they've been with us ever since, trying to teach us. And we've been busy ever since trying to mostly ignore them. But it's not working. And these messenger molecules, these psychedelic messenger molecules, are what is mediating consciousness and the operation of consciousness in the brain of what I like to call the problematic primates. That's us. We're problematic in many ways. We're also, we're pretty interesting. It's a double-edged sword, right? Do I need to worry about time? All right. It won't be too long. Well, we'll see. But so, this is the thesis. This is our own built-in mysterium tremendum that nature has gifted to us as a way to learn how to be humans. And they're messenger molecules. They're just like the messenger molecules in these secondary metabolites. They send messages. That's how they mediate their relationships with other organisms. So if they're messenger molecules, what's the message already? Pretty simple. Symbiosis, baby. They want to form, I use the term want advisedly, plants and other organisms, they want to form symbiosis with this problematic primates. Because for them, this has a lot of advantage. If you form a symbiosis with the primates, they might domesticate you, they might protect you from the vicissitudes of natural selection and bring you under our wing, and that's like getting a free ride, a free pass on Easy Street. They don't have to compete with all the organisms in the environment as long as they keep that relationship going with these problematic primates who, for one reason or another, value these things for nutrition or psychedelic effects or other medicinal effects or all sorts of things. So the psychedelic plants are the most dramatic of these, but any kind of relationship with plants that is a symbiotic relationship is kind of like that. It's a kind of symbiosis. And it works until we manage to completely detoxify the planet. Symbiosis of this kind works. Of course, we're vigorously trying to do that, so we'll see how much longer this lasts. But symbiosis is the order of the day, and evolutionary biology is realizing that it's more about symbiosis and collaboration and competition is far more important in evolution than competition, than the whole nature red and tooth and claw model. And in order to deal with the information that these plant teachers are bringing to us, it gave us some tools. We had to develop essentially some technologies to deal with this information and use it in useful ways. And one of these earliest inventions of this was shamanism. And shamanism is basically a technology. It's a range of traditional beliefs and practices concerned with communication with this perceived spirit world. It's a way to navigate in these non-ordinary realities, interact with the non-human intelligences encountered there, and obtaining knowledge from that realm that's useful to individuals and the community, such as the treatment of illness, the uses of medicinal plants, the location of game, propitious times to plant and harvest, and that kind of thing in later cultures. So the induction of altered states of consciousness to access these realms most usually comes through the use of these entheogenic plants. Not invariably, but that's the big component of it. And shamanism is not really a religion. Shamanism is as old or older than religion. It's not different from religion, but in significant ways it is. Religion emerged out of shamanism, but also out of shamanism emerged medicine, pharmacology, chemistry, theater, art, poetry. All of these find their roots, if you will, no pun intended, in this ancient relationship with these teacher plants. So it's a very practical technology. We had access to these tremendously impactful experiences, this being up close to the mysterium tremendum, and we needed some way to deal with this, and this is what we came up with, and it is more or less effective. We find it useful. I love this passage from the book Hallucinogens and Shamanism, by the chapter called The Mushrooms of Language by Henry Munn. The shaman's role in these cultures is as much as a poet as a healer. The shaman is someone who, through language, songs, and stories, expresses the cosmic and mythical narratives of their culture as received in the shamanic trance. The person who articulates the cosmology and the worldview of these cultures. And here's the passage. Language is an ecstatic activity of signification, intoxicated by the mushrooms. The fluency, the ease, the aptness of expression one becomes capable of are such that one is astounded by the words that issue forth from the contact of the intention of articulation with the matter of experience. The spontaneity the mushrooms liberate is not only perceptual, but linguistic. For the shaman, it is as if existence were uttering itself through him. And this was written in 1973, and the word probably should have been through her, because the early shamans were probably women like the revered Maria Sabina there. And another thing that we invented, not too much after that, was religion. That was one of the things that emerged out of shamanism. And it had its uses too, but it was not quite the same. Religion is a set of beliefs and practices, often centered on specific supernatural and moral claims about reality, the cosmos, and human nature, and often codified as prayer, ritual, and religious law. Religion also encompasses ancestral or cultural traditions, writings, history, and mythology, as well as personal faith and mystic experience. The term religion refers to both the personal practices related to communal faith and to group rituals and communication stemming from shared conviction. Psychedelics themselves are not religion, but they activate religious sensibilities. It turns out built into the brain is the neural machinery required to have transcendently meaningful experiences. For obvious reasons. Now we know why that's so useful, because it drove evolution forward. So then we can start to get back to the original question, which will never be adequately answered. But we can ask this question: how old is consciousness? Consciousness is characterized by the integration of inner phenomenal experiences with perceptual and material interactions with perceived external reality. This is the reality hallucination that we were discussing. When did this ability first emerge in humans? Let's grant for a minute that this ability to represent an inner model, a model of the world, that is the kind of defining characteristic of consciousness. Well, we don't know. But characteristics of it. are probably, this is the controlled use of fire again, that enabled this to emerge. Fire was maybe developed as long as 2 million years ago, probably a lot earlier or somewhat earlier, and one of the greatest inventions in human cultural evolution. And as a direct consequence of this, early humans were able to implement a degree of control of their environment never before possible. It enabled, as we said before, migration into these savanna habitats, which was a very critical development because it brought us in touch with the first teachers, the first plant teachers, which ironically are not plants. More efficient hunting tools, cooking, omnivory, the roots of pharmacology and chemistry. Pretty significant developments that enabled us to become human, or become different humans. Unconscious creatures don't do that. This was done by conscious creatures, conscious humans. So that said, what does the record look like? We have to rely on archaeology, and archaeology is very, especially paleoarchaeology, is more full of holes and questions than actual answers. But again, looking at the dating, we can see, it first showed up in these spear points and hand axes and stone tools that were used to strip animal skins and this kind of thing. So you get some of the oldest are the Old One hand axes, 2 million years ago. 2 million years ago, humans were making these things. 280 kilo years ago in Ethiopia, so a big jump. They were, didn't, like Graham mentioned, once they invented this technology, it was kind of boring. It was like there wasn't rapid technological change or technological innovation. I sometimes wish that Apple would take a page out of this because they introduce, upgrades all the time, and do we really need it? But that's another conversation. Javelin points, pottery shards, and again, the only definitive record of ceramics is in this site in China, only 20,000 kilo years ago. But as I mentioned, these fire-hardened clay fragments were found again at this site in China 1.5 million years ago. But it's not clear that that was actually pottery, and maybe it was just clay that actually accidentally got burned. Not really clear, but so this was kind of the roots of this technology. But again, these, they were made by conscious beings, but they were very utilitarian. They were beautiful, but they don't necessarily reflect an artistic sensibility. But then we can go to this. And this is definitively dated at 500,000 years. And this is art. You're not going to see, and this is not going to, the Mona Lisa, it ain't, right? But it's art in the sense that these are scratches. These are rectilinear scratches on a shell that was uncovered at the site of the Java Man, the so-called Java Man. And it says in December 2014, a scientific team of archaeologists at Leiden University announced the discovery of an engraved mollusk shell collected over 100 years ago at the famous Homo erectus excavation of Trini in eastern Java. The recently examined specimen was found in a museum collection of freshwater mollusk shells collected by Dutch anatomist and geologist Eugene Dubois, the discoverer of the first specimens of Java Man. And they published this article. And the investigators said about this, quote, "It was a eureka moment. I could see immediately they were man-made engravings. There was no other explanation," said team member Dr. Stephen Monroe. "This is the first time we have found evidence for Homo erectus dating from approximately 1.89 million years ago to 143,000 years ago. Behaving this way, it rewrites human history. If you want a definitive, well-dated, well-documented archaeological discovery that, incontrovertibly represents consciousness. This is it. But let's keep on going. Okay, what about figurines? You're all probably familiar with the Venus figurines that are found throughout Eastern Europe, thought to be fertility symbols. They're, sometimes very sophisticated representations of, basically big fat women. And fat in part because they were pregnant often. And so they were like a fetish of fertility, right? Some of those things are extremely beautiful and represent high degrees of artistic skill and sensibility. But there are earlier precursors that are not so clear. Before I discuss that further, I have to mention this one here. This is rather puzzling. This is called the Makapansgat Pebble from Makapansky Cave, South Africa. 3 million years. And it's not made. It was not an artifact. Nobody carved this, but it was found at a site that was known to have been inhabited by Australopithecines, so we're several genera earlier than Homo even, and it was miles from the closest possible source of minerals. So the interpretation is that this resembles a human face, as you can see, and it may be that that resonated with whatever hominid found this, and enough to pick it up and take it back to the cave. But then these Venus figurines, these are the oldest Venus figurines, and there is actually controversy as to whether these are natural or artificial. And the consensus seems to be that these were interesting shaped rocks, just like this was, but then resembled human figures enough that whoever found them modified them, and they added ochre coloring, and they maybe, carved them a little bit. And they go back, that one's 300 to 500 thousand years. This one's more, maybe 230,000 years. This is a long time ago. Far longer than any of the paleoanthropology that Graham was talking about, which is great. But this goes back, and we don't know. We don't know, but it looks like that does reflect cognitive function. And so then we have to jump forward, far a long way. We have to jump forward 160,000 years. 160,000 years. Think about that. That's 20 times the age of our civilization. If we say modern, the modern civilization of 8 to 10,000 to 12,000. You have to go to the Lombos cave in South Africa, 70 to 80,000 years ago. And there they found these ochre plaques engraved with abstract designs and these beads with holes punched in them, obviously used to make necklaces. These are artifacts. These are pieces of art. And sometime between the dating of this cave and right up to into historical times almost, up to about 2000 before present, there was really an explosion of artistic expression in all parts of the world to which humans have migrated. And most notably in the wonderful, amazing cave art, which are not only in Europe, but all over the place. They're found in Indonesia and in Spain and even in the New World, in India, Western Australia. These things show up. They're not terribly old compared to those artifacts, but they're still, damn old, right? And they more or less 40,000 years ago is kind of a benchmark for when these things occurred, when these things were made. So, we had fire technology long before any of these things were made. We could have made these images, and, well, not us, but whoever was doing it, millions of years ago, but that didn't happen apparently, or it hasn't been discovered. So the fire technology was there, but the artistic ability to, the abstraction ability was not there. So, And then we come to the psychedelic plants. So the question is, I postulate that when we our ancestors first moved into the savanna environment, they came in contact with the psychedelic mushrooms and had these experiences. We don't find any art related to psychedelics until much, much, much later. Most of the psychedelic, iconography that we find, which Graham showed too, well dated. Probably the oldest of these images is maybe 10,000 years. That's not very old, in the time frames that we're discussing. That would be, would be the Tasali mushroom images. Pretty clearly, this is a shaman of some sort holding clusters of mushrooms, and here you've got mushroom-headed figures running along excitedly, waving, guess what, mushrooms. And all over the world, at about the same time, you see these images show up. You see the peyote buttons in the lower Pecos region about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. The mushroom stones from Guatemala, which go back 3,000 BC. Chavin, which he talked about, which had a San Pedro San Pedro cactus cult, and elaborate ceremonial places that were, highly engineered for their acoustic properties. And of course, the Selva Pascuala cave in Spain, 4,000 to 6,000 BC, with these clearly mushrooming icons, almost identifiable. There's a species that still grows in this region, which look very much like these. So, and Graham talked about those. And the snuffs, the South American snuffs, probably the oldest psychedelics in the New World, unambiguously. The snuffs, a lot of the coastal cultures had these snuffs made from ananthanthera, a species of legume with these flat seeds, and you can make the snuffs. And these are, the date here is 3,500 BC, but we now know from recent discoveries that they go back 8 to 10,000 years. So a Chavin, Corral, which Graham talked about, Tiwanaku, these are the oldest megalithic civilizations in the New World, and they were absolutely loaded on snuffs a good deal of the time. Interesting. Okay, and then we come to another really important development in evolution and in cultural evolution, which of course is the appearance of agriculture. Whether that was discovered or invented is not clear, but it's at least as important as the controlled use of fire. And, with some hesitation, I would venture to say maybe it was almost as important as the discovery of psychedelic plants and fungi. It was pretty darn important because it changed, again, the whole enterprise of human evolution. We shifted from hunter-gatherers to agrarian societies. And in some ways you could interpret that as a formalization of the symbiosis between plants and humans since before we were humans. So we took deliberate steps to begin to gather plants into one place and cultivate them. And it made the life of the plants a lot easier, and certainly the life of us a lot easier. Because this fostered this transition from nomadic to sedentary lifestyles. And it enabled us to get our basic necessities without having to forage in the environment for that. So it led to a literal rooting of human societies, enabled us to establish villages and then complex cities, and out of that grew systems of law and politics, science, and technology. And all of this, of course, is based on language and the ability to store information outside the self and communicate in complex ways with each other. And so this was the fundamental foundation for culture and what we now can put under the rubric of civilization. So culture, as a human artifact was not anticipated in evolution. And when culture appeared, this language-generated invention, if you will, in human behavior, it's overtaken biological evolution. Biological evolution happens slowly. Cultural evolution happens quickly, right? In terms of the time frames we've been talking about, millions of years. Well, culture was not really a thing until about 12,800 years ago. So a mere, less than 15,000 years, there's been human institutions that we might call culture. So that's really a short amount of time, And if we look at the time frames we've been discussing, there could have been, civilizations equivalent of ours, as old as ours, 10, 20, 30 times over, and maybe they were disappeared, but probably not. But once that happened, once we sort of made the total symbiosis with plants and the pact with this technology, that shift was the most dangerous event in planetary evolution, and also the most promising, because it gave us the ability to advance in a very rapid way through the invention of technology, which was the main way that we now adapt to our environment. It was dangerous because it also put into our hands controls of technology that even now we're not wise enough to use in a beneficial way. And this is our task. Can you change the slide? Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah. Just one mention here. So this is a two-way street, right? We adopted these plants, and they kind of gave over their genetic independence, if you want to put it that way. We started manipulating with their genes, right? By selective breeding, and basically breeding for properties that we value, taste or nutritional qualities or pharmacological properties or whatever, things that were useful to us. And in that process, while they were impacting us, we were impacting them. These are essentially GMOs. These are human genetically modified plants. I mean, we're not taking genes out and putting sharks' genes into them and that kind of thing. But through selective breeding, a natural process, you're not going to see anything like this in nature. Thank God. And cannabis is another good example. It has had such a long relationship with the human species. There is no wild species. What you find are human artifacts. These are artifacts. These are inventions or modifications of what was there. So the impact was great, And out of that, and in the context of these early agrarian societies, this, if you look at the Mediterranean, out of that, this religious, mystical tradition of the psychedelic mystery religions based on the sacred use of mushrooms, probably, maybe other things as well. And these mystery religions were based on, kind of the essential characteristics of psychedelic experience, the experience of a transcendent other, this mysterium tremendum that somehow we had to come to terms with, the notion of oceanic boundlessness, which is a characteristic of psychedelics, that we're not separated, we're all part of the cosmos, an apprehension of the unity of all existence. These things in these early ecstasy-based matriarchal mystery religions based on a celebration of human biology and ecstasy and sexuality and all of that were the temple at Eleusis was the last instantiation of this. But before that, stretching all the way back to the Paleolithic, were these mystery religions. And Eleusis was just the last one that lasted in historical time until the Romans came along and basically sacked the temple of Eleusis. They were, the minions of the Christian-dominated by this time culture, and that was the end of the ecstatic, mystery religions. And to our loss, I would say. So here we are. We're in the middle of our historical odyssey, and we're in, the mushrooms stretch back who knows how long, how far. If they were the catalyst for this emergence into consciousness and culture, we're now somewhere in the middle of it. And maybe we're more toward the end of this thing that we call history. We're haunted inevitably by the notion that history will end. History is the product of language and culture. No other species in nature dwells in historical time the way we do. They don't have a sense of history. None of them can anticipate their individual death, or the death of their species, or the death of our planet. Only humanity, the curious monkey, the problematic primate, does that. And in fact, in this historical era, the early years of the third millennium, speculation regarding our eventual fate on the Earth we are rapidly destroying has reached the level not of curiosity, but a cultural obsession, a cultural preoccupation at least. One thing that we can say, the same curious, evolutionarily hypertrophied monkey brain that got us into this mess in the first place is the only thing that will get us out of it. Our task at the close of our historical journey is the same one we were faced with at the beginning: to understand ourselves and our place in nature. The plant teachers have always been with us. They're still with us. They're still teaching. Hopefully, we're still learning. And the question is, if a mushroom was at the beginning of this odyssey, which one will be at the end? The choice is ours. Thank you.